Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Art of Cybersecurity series by 7 Rules Cyber. I'm your host, Chirag Joshi. Now, in this series, we've covered a lot of different aspects related to cybersecurity, from leadership to journalism to law and everything in between. So I encourage you to check out our previous episodes. Today's one, though, is very special because I have a very special guest who is someone who I've had a really long conversation with in one of our past episodes. He is Michael Oberlaender, and he's a global CISO, one of the best people I can think about to have this special conversation. And the special conversation today, which we're going to tackle, is derived from a watershed moment, if I can call it, in cybersecurity that happened recently, where in the US, the US Security and Exchanges Commission actually has charged SolarWinds and their CISO with a very serious charge. And the charge is they misled investors and internal control failures weren't revealed. A lot of different charges which are very serious and first of its kind in many ways. So it's created conversation in the CISO community all across the world. And I believe it has a potential to fundamentally change how we think about cybersecurity. So which is why I wanted to have somebody who's really knowledgeable, who's tuned into these things, somebody who has so much experience and can see the future and is US based, which makes a difference. And you're in Australia. For us in Australia, we know that ASIC, our Australian Securities and Investment Commission, has actually come out and said very clearly that they are expecting to go after companies that are not exercising the cybersecurity controls that are commensurate to their risks. So we are seeing regulatory action everywhere. But before I go on too long, let me bring Michael on formally. Michael, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for making the time. And Michael, I remember the last episode that we did. This is almost a sequel to it. We ended that episode, and I'll put a link in the show notes. We ended that episode talking about this potential action that was coming forward, and now we are there. So welcome. Let's dive right into it. How have you been, Michael, first of all, before we go into it? How have you been?
Well, thank you, Chirag, for having me. I really appreciate the invitation here. And I have been good. I have actually talked quite a lot about this and other subjects recently, and awesome conferences and in newsletters, newspapers, Wall Street Journal, Computer World, and many others. And most recently, last week here, a conference in Houston for the National Motor Freight Association, and was speaking there on the panel about API security because the subject is widely and broad. But I enjoy being here. I enjoy doing a second round with you, and this most recent decision to actually put charges against SolarWinds and even more so against the CISO there is, from my perspective, very concerning. Before I dive in, I just want to share with the watchers or with the folks seeing this show. I have been in 8 prior global CISO roles. I'm a book author. I've published 2 books and hundreds of articles. You can find me on LinkedIn. And I do this since 25 years full-time and then 35 years overall in technology and cyber. So I can tell you I have been dealing with issues over the world in different industries, different companies, almost the large majority of my entire life, of my professional life. When I saw first these wealth notes that came actually out against him and SolarWinds, I saw this coming. But I have just over the last 2 or 3 days reviewed the charges. I'm not a lawyer, to be clear, right? I'm a CISO, but I have read them through, browsed them through, and I found already several points that are not making sense, that are definitely wrong. And before I go into the details, I want to say that I am concerned because, yes, it can have long-term a positive impact on security. However, if this goes on the cost of the people, the very few and only that actually spend their life to protect companies, to protect enterprises, to protect assets, crown jewels, and then they start. If you look at the accountability scheme from left to right, left is all the problems that come from the top, from the board, from the C-suite, and then you go through and you have at the end the CISO starting then at the end or at the lower bottom of the problem and basically shooting with a loose cannon on those folks. That is detrimental to the industry, and that is detrimental to the overall security posture, and it will not improve. There actually will probably several CISOs that are just not coming back to the market or leave elsewhere and so forth. And that is of big concern because we have not enough qualified cybersecurity leaders, and I see this with really a concerned eye here. I'm not saying that, in generally speaking, that everything from the SEC is bad. I'm not saying that it's not a good idea to go after companies that intentionally and knowingly make wrong statements or fail their investors or fail their customers. I'm absolutely for that actually there should be charges pressed. However, what I see in this case, and interestingly, very similar to the Uber case, they go for the CISO. They're not going for the CEO, who is actually the person absolutely in control and accountable, the CFO, maybe the chief legal officer or general counsel, or maybe, depending on the reporting structure, the CTO or CIO. No, they start at the bottom. They start with a CISO. And that is sheer wrong, and that should not be the case. Having said this in a broad fashion, I want to say, of course, if the CISO continuously makes publicly wrong statements and actually says things that he or she knows it's not true, that is something to be avoided. And depending on the details, and we need to see the facts and the evidence, so to speak, there may be some things warranted or not. I can't speak to that, and I don't want to. However, based on the charges that I have read, the SEC has made some statements that, in my view, are not correct and that are not applicable or / misunderstood or construed even. And I hope that he has, I'm talking about the CISO there, that he has a good lawyer that really will defend him. But let's dive into more subjects. I give it back to you.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, we've dived right into it, and I think that's really important. And look, I think just for our audience, and a lot of our audience is very tuned into cybersecurity affairs, but just to give our audience a view, what has really come about, and I can put a link in the show notes to the SEC press release on this topic. But they've actually said that, you know, the company in question here, SolarWinds, misled investors about its cybersecurity practices and known risks. And it says that an SEC's complaint alleges that multiple communications among SolarWinds employees, that include the CISO, throughout 2019, 2020, questioned the ability of the organization to protect its critical assets from cyber attacks, critical assets. And look, some of the quotes when I read in that release were quite interesting because, you know, it's sadly, it happens fairly often that we're all struggling to keep track of our vulnerabilities and patch them and stay ahead of it. But the key bit here to me is the fact that, you know, you were aware, but you failed to resolve or sufficiently raise further awareness within the company. And that's where it is coming back to is, you were aware. Did you raise it? Did you action it? Was it accepted? And I think about this, right? And in my role as CISO, in my books, even like Michael, I've said there are 2 rules to my 7 rules, and they both start with, the first one is cybersecurity is a business risk, like it's a business issue. The second one is it's a risk management exercise, and it's not a technical risk management exercise; it's a business corporate risk management exercise. And when I read these things, my first instinct was something's missing in these areas. And when the Wells notice was issued, when we last spoke, Michael, and between now and then, I think while we could see some of it, I wasn't expecting it to go this far. And it's an interesting outcome, and it has created so many debates in the CISO community. I've been reading reactions everywhere, everything from, yes, SEC has to do the right thing. If you mislead investors, if you're not taking care of your risks, it's a problem. And then the other extreme is, how can you go after the CISO? Like, why the CISO? Is CISO the only person or only executive responsible? And so the reactions have been very varied. And to that, maybe my first question to you, Michael, along these lines is the role of the CISO, right? We talked about it last time. We talked about the evolution of the role, but this has actually changed it. Is how does this reshape the role of a CISO from a liability perspective, from a responsibility perspective, from a true C executive perspective?
Yeah, great point. And this is my view here. So think about everyone in security, or at least somewhat in security, knows about the governance module about the RACI charts. We have all seen that, right? ISACA or other such controls. Right, RACI stands for responsibility, accountability, consult, and inform. And if you look at this from a corporate perspective, there's one person that is accountable. There's only one. And that's the CEO, Chief Executive Officer. That person has the full accountability for the enterprise, no doubt. And if you talk to lawyers, they will confirm that as well. Now, of course, he or she can delegate and have multiple people that are responsible for sub things, right? And there will be a CIO, there will be a CISO, there will be a chief legal officer, and so forth. And then those folks have to work in tandem and with other teams and beneath them and so forth, and consult with others and inform others and make sure that the information flow is there. But the accountability needs to come from the top. You cannot, and that is what I said in the beginning statement, you cannot hold people accountable that have not the necessary final, and I mean final, ultimate decision authority, if they have not the budgets or have not the resources or cannot say this needs to go right away to the SEC, it needs to be publicly reported, or we need to change the statements that are currently on our webpage and so forth. If the CISO cannot do that, the CISO is not the person that is accountable. That's the person that holds all the strings, the purse strings, as well as those final decision authorities. Now, I can see if this change and this lawsuit over time, depending how it comes out, may change the overall community, and that actually it plays in favor for the CISO, so that they then have what we discussed in the prior session, really a seat at the table, that they really have the necessary methods to bite and really move things forward. But currently, that's not the case. And the question is, do the SEC folks and others really want to have a Dr. No again, right? So he or she has to push everything through and hammer it through because companies and C-suite executives are oftentimes very reluctant to give the necessary time and effort and support for security. So that's the question there, right? Where we will go, and if that becomes the Dr. No, or if they are really equipped and really prepared and provided to do that right. Currently, in the way as it stands in the lawsuit, you need basically to make sure several things. A, you need to communicate what you communicate, to have it in writing to the C-suite, to the CEO / to the chief legal officer. You need to make sure that you have a separate copy. You need to make sure that you communicate that to your entire staff, especially to the security teams. No, and I find this crazy, but no jokes about our security posture. No one is supposed to say anything that could be misled. That is happening. There were some guys that are in the charges. There are some statements where they quote them literally. And in some cases, this is obviously just joking around or trying to get off some pressure, but not like they truly fully admit in the court of law, yes, we knew that the whole company was not working security-wise. That's nonsense. People oftentimes say under pressure certain things without really understanding the circumstances and what they really say there, and maybe have not even the full insights as they should before they make such statements. But that would lead to the fact that the CISOs have to forbid any joking about that. You would have to fire people in the sales department that is talking with a customer and saying anything that is not 100% accurate from a risk perspective. Guess about that. We all have purchased software. We all have leveraged hardware or whatever, and we have all been lied to by our vendors. Now, if you suddenly have this kind of fire them or massive cutthroat, this is nonsense. And I don't think that this is smart, and it's not the way how we should proceed as community, as global industry. That's nonsense, right? We need to find a way to do this in the right fashion with governance, with certain controls. But the CISO for sure needs to have direct access to the board, direct access to the CEO, the ability, if this stays in the way it is, the ability to actually communicate with the SEC. And I think there will be changes and challenges, because not every CISO has a legal background, has a financial background, understands what material risk is, and. So there will be a lot of uphill battles and conflicts over the next couple of years. And I think the smarter approach from the SEC or for the SEC would have been a different one. And I mentioned that maybe to you in the last call during the when I was quoted in Wall Street Journal. I indicated that, look, if they would give upfront and proactively to the CISOs the right controls, the right mechanisms, and say the board needs to have a risk and cybersecurity aware contact in the board, have knowledge there, maybe a prior CISO or people like myself that could join the board and help them out, or they need to have any sort of escalation method that they can go to the board if there is some material wrongdoing or some material misrepresentation. But that's not happening. They dropped that requirement. Currently, the boards are left basically alone, and they just push the whole accountability and responsibility onto the CISO. And that's not right, because they are not equipped for that. And I don't think that this is a smart move. They should have done this the other way around. But we are currently seeing exactly what I was concerned about last time.
Now, look, there are so many things to unpack here, right? And you brought up the chilling effect, the negative effect of all of this is something you laid out, where something was said internally. Are we going to go back to being the department of no, which we fought so hard to get away from that mindset? I think those can be real issues, because I know a quote that SEC put out in his press release was that one of the employees there said that we are so far from being a security minded company, and you don't know the context, right? And again, yes. I'm no lawyer. I'm like you, I'm a CISO, I'm a cybersecurity practitioner. And we are not talking here with specific insights from what has not been made public here. So I'm not going to weigh in like you. We're not going to weigh in on the what happened behind the closed doors here. But what we are trying to do here is think about what it means for all of us. And to me, it still goes back to, and I don't know, right? I don't know if these were followed, but it still goes back to things that we've been saying for years. Is it starts with the right accountability. Here in Australia, our financial regulator, APRA, has said, board of directors here essentially have the accountability and are responsible for the programs of their companies. It starts with the right accountabilities. It also starts with the right visibility of your crown jewel assets, because that's what is talked about, is crown jewel assets, the visibility of those. Then it has the risk aspect of it. Are you managing the risk to them appropriately? Which means that I don't care what technology you put in, what shiny tool is it there. Are you identifying the business risk based on a cyber threat and the controls that come in? And is that managed well according to the business requirements and the risk appetite? So it's all very basic to me. When I read that, I'm like, this is very basic. And obviously, you need the corporate governance aspect. And you mentioned this. I did a talk recently with a good friend of mine here at Australia's largest cyber conference, and we called it a CISO and a lawyer walk into a bar. And it was a bit of a funny thing, but the theme was we need to work so closely together, and that happened before these charges. And I almost feel like that message needs to be more. CISOs are part of corporate governance. So if I'm a CISO now, I need to think about these things very clearly. What are the accountabilities? Do I have a view of my assets? Are my cyber risks as part of the enterprise risk taxonomy? Are my reports going to the right place? And when they decide not to action something, is that consistent with the risk appetite? Because I and a CISO in most cases will not be decision makers. We are advisors. And an advisor, if it's held liable, is a very unique attribute. Of course, unless you're misstating things, misguiding people, and you're incompetent. And if you're incompetent, then it brings into question, is that sufficient to press charges? Maybe. But
yeah, but let me chime in there about the governance aspect.
Yes, please go.
I have a concern, right? So if you would actually respond directly to the way how they have filed the charges, what we would have to do in the future is that we have our risk register, and each time when we have a new edition, we would actually have to write, if it is material, to rightly forward it to the SEC. But this creates another burden of problems, because then suddenly the bad guys, they just go to the public statements, look up the EDGAR database, and they find all my vulnerabilities and risks that I have so gladly identified as crown jewels, and they are unprotected. So this is not right. This is nonsense. We need to find a way where we have accountability and responsibility, but give the necessary tools and controls so that it can actually be solved. Think about this. You come as a CISO in a new company that you have not worked before. There is predominantly huge amounts of risk that you are not aware of, that probably others in the company are not aware of. But in the moment that you have the CISO title, they consider you as accountable, which is wrong. You can't fix everything in, let's say, 3 weeks or 3 months or even 3 years if that has built up over 30 years or longer, right? This takes time to resolve, and it takes a smart approach, a risk-based approach with support, with money, with resources, with prioritization, with a strategy, and updated regularly support and strategy changes if you come into new avenues. But that is currently all missing. And the concern is here that we start with the liability aspect, with the accountability aspect, and basically dump all the charges on the smallest player instead of fixing the true problems, right? That lots of companies have not enough risk oversight, have not enough defined risk appetite, are not following through their risk register and then really act upon that. And hear me out. So the concern, in my view, is it's all good to go for companies that are not doing the right things. It's good to basically charge them and sue them if they are telling customers or if financial investors stuff that is absolutely inaccurate. but do it in a smart way. Don't do it with the one person in the company that really tries and does everything to make it better. And instead, start at the very top. Keep the CEOs accountable, as we did with SOX, right? And the CFO accountable, those folks that hold the purse strings, that make the business decisions, the ultimate business decisions. And then they can in tandem work with the CISOs and others to make things better. But the concern is the approach in my view here.
Yeah, and on that, Mike, let me ask you this, right? So you are US based. We obviously, both of us, we do a fair bit of global work, but you are US based. You are in those communities today, and I know you hold a lot of a lot of weight in your circles there with regards to your expertise. The conversations there in the US, I've read a lot of press releases and public comments and spoken to some of my friends and colleagues there. But from your perspective, what are you seeing in terms of the regulations that exist today, and what would need to change potentially as a result of this that will have the accountabilities fixed? Because I'll give you an example. In Australia, we have an interesting regulatory environment where we have recently, like I mentioned, APRA, which is our financial regulator. They've been very clear. They've been very clear what the expectations are. Our recent Security of Critical Infrastructure Act in Australia also brought about this quite clearly. A risk management plans required. You need to have the right accountabilities. Like I said, our ASIC, which is our Security Investment Commission, have said this openly as well. So the board director responsibility is becoming very clear. But that's for these sectors. The other ones, I still think a big gap there. But when I look at the US, which is much larger, and I know very unique in the way the states operate as well, from my time there, what are you seeing in terms of regulations, and where do you, if you put your forecasting hat on, what do you think will change?
So I can only hope that there will be an additional SEC change that actually puts the necessary cybersecurity knowledge into the board, so that the board must have cybersecurity knowledge, have an expert, has a dedicated person that is the basically, if you want, the oversight person for the CISO, where the CISO can escalate. And that is currently not the place. That's currently really a big issue. That's definitely for sure one. Another one is that the government is always giving new rules, but they are failing to get actually a federal privacy law in place, right? Just think about that. We have two different, sometimes each time mutually exclusive laws and regulations across the 50 states. So that's an issue as well. We have the continuous increase and upgrades of the cyber weapons with the nation states and so forth. So the threat landscape is getting worse and worse by the day, by the hour. And similarly, the vulnerabilities are worse and worse by the hour. And my concern is here, if they only focus on this vulnerability piece, actually in the charges, they say that the CISO has to fix these vulnerabilities. He was aware of several vulnerabilities, so he didn't fix them. So guess what? You come into a place, you have I'm not making this up, you have 100 or 200 millions of vulnerabilities, and you then build a team, do a vulnerability management team, do a threat team, do a risks team, GRC team, and several others in the SOC for operations. And then over time, you analyze the vulnerabilities, you prioritize them on based off risk, and then over time, you try to fix them. But this takes years. Think about 200 million vulnerabilities. You can't fix them all at once. So you will accept certain risks. You will have to deal with them. And then if you go to the materiality, then you have to respond quickly. And if you come to the conclusion, this is really important, like the case what they made there with the VPN, there was a vulnerability that wasn't fixed, and there were administrative rights everywhere and so forth. Yes, granted and given, these are problems, but these are problems that are prevalent across the enterprises everywhere, in every country, in every organization. I've seen this too many times that I would not saying that, right? I tell you, this is going on. And what we need to have is really an understanding from the regulators that these things are not happening in vacuum. They are really happening with a history, and we need to give the necessary times and the necessary support to enable those folks that are in the CISO seat and maybe in the CIO seat and work together and solve the problems before it's too late. But the way it's currently happening, it's crazy. And I hear this from many others in my areas, in my spaces with whom I talk and exchange. There's a lot of concern with these regulations and upgrades, and I think that there needs to be an improvement and another upgrade, maybe a version 2.0 or so in the near future, hopefully.
Yeah, and look, key points, right? So I've always, and there's a workshop I was doing recently, and I've done a few of these, which are, around communicating patching risk to executives and boards, communicating those vulnerabilities. So we know there are so many, we drown in them. If anybody is like, I know we are not doing a technical discussion here, but look at the CVE details, and you will see a big constant upswing in number of vulnerability released, the severity of them. So it's all the time, right? That's just nature of what we do. And you can't fix all of them, which is where the materiality aspect comes in, is so important, and reasonable security measures, which is why I'm saying we need to be best friends with lawyers and with our corporate governance colleagues. But if you are a CISO, a technical CISO who's now moved into a leadership role, aspiring CISO, or a board director, reach out for expertise. And this is the advice I can give: is reach out, and it doesn't have to be people like me or Michael, but reach out to qualified people. People like us can actually talk to you about these aspects, because they're not technical discussions here. We're not talking which severity of vulnerability and which patch needs to apply. When we are talking about material risks, and there are notifications required, because if we focus on materiality well, if we define it well, we raise those risks properly, we at least have a defensible security posture. And we get away from the situations where we are potentially accused of not raising effective awareness. Because I can say, you define materiality in this way, we signed off as an organization, this quantifies a material risk, I have raised a material risk to the right body as defined by the corporate governance structure. That's all I can do. And that's where my role as an advisor essentially is now handing over and listening to advice and getting that other inputs. But if we don't do that, we run that risk. And Michael, I have a question for you, right? This goes back to selfishly now the CISO aspect as well. What do you think in the US are the whistleblowing protections that CISOs could have benefited in this? And if you now take on a CISO role for an organization, a large company, listed company, would you be going with your lawyer to make sure that, hey, you are covered from a liability indemnity perspective?
So I would say this is a multi-pronged question and needs to be really multi-pronged answered. So the whistleblower thing is really a problem, right? So you can't be hired as the CISO and then you basically go to protect yourself and do some bad things for the company. So there has to be integrity, there has to be human leadership. But you can do things to protect you as the person, right? So you need to have, of course, D&O insurance. So D&O is directors and officers insurance. You need to have errors and omission insurance. You must make sure that you have indemnity protection. You must make sure you have gap coverage and liability protection, and make sure for the company you have some sort of cyber insurance, right? Because in cases of losses that you can recoup some money. So that is something you can do. You need to have it in a contract. Make sure that you have in your employment contract or in your employment offer clearly stated what are your duties and the expectations, basically the job duties you have to fulfill. And then back up to whom are you reporting? Are you reporting? You have direct access to the CEO, and how do you report about risk? That you have the right to override everything, and that you cannot be isolated and be somewhere buried in a whatever group. You need to have access and to report that risk upwards, so that can be promoted into the SEC or otherwise to the public if you are a public hold company. And then you need, over the contract timeline, you need multiple additional statements in there so that you are covered. If you leave the company, is the coverage continuing for prior things? Like the guy now is currently sued for stuff that happened several years ago. I don't know if he's still with the company, but that kind of protection, that kind of liability and indemnification and D&O and so forth, insurance need to be covering you in the time to come, even if you have left the company. And then depending on what are the circumstances when you leave your place, ensure that all of these things are basically addressed in the contract that you have, in the either severance package or in the employment contract that you're in. It may be slightly differing, but you need to cover these points to protect yourself. What I saw in the cases like with Uber, Joe, and now probably in this case as well, that there will be some legal deals maybe done behind the scenes. But what concerns me, and I really mean this, I stated this at the very beginning, what concerns me is that all in this food chain, in the hierarchy, have not been charged or not been sued. Not the CEO, not the CFO, not the chief legal officer, not the CIO and CTO, just the CISO. that's really a concern. And I think that is somehow a risk there and a game changer for the overall industry, because no one is taking that personal risk without the comparative protection, so to speak. And that is currently a big concern on everyone's mind here.
Yeah. Look, you brought up a lot of practical steps that the CISOs and leaders can take to protect themselves, and I agree with them. I think it's we got to think about this now in a different way, because and remember last time when we spoke, we talked about the fact that the CISO role is very poorly defined. There is no standard kind of CISO role. Like a CFO, people understand largely what they do. The CISO could be a technical specialist to a business leader. And now's the time where we are very clear about the definition and the extent of what we are taking responsibilities for. And for organizations to realize that, and not just organizations, I think, and this is a comment I'll make for the community, if a breach happens, and you think of the CISO as that person who was responsible or should have been on top of it, that's a problem. It is, well, are there bad CISOs out there? Probably. I can't comment for every CISO, right? But the most ones I know, they are working very hard every day to keep up just with the non-stop demand. And you touched upon the compliance reporting aspect of it. That is so underrated. Even if a minor incident occurs or something that is, moderate incident, I'm not talking about catastrophic incidents. There are so many committees that you want to report to. There's so many things you want to present to. The paperwork of it can be immense in many organizations, the mature ones. And we got to start thinking about this a bit differently here. So are we going to be spending more time protecting ourselves as opposed to protecting our people and the assets that we are responsible for? I think that's where this can go, and which is why I am really keen that we don't go down this path. But I want to just, there are two things I want to close off on. And one thing, the first one is the OT security aspect, the operational technology security aspect of it. And I bring that up because when it comes to data and security breaches, which relates to information, absolutely a problem. Nobody's minimizing them. But when it comes to OT security, you're talking about people's physical safety and lives, like actual lives at risk. Now, in this kind of scenario, if you had a similar case which was very direct to an OT impact, or which impacted people's lives and lives were lost or severely injured, what do you reckon? What do you reckon could be the case, and how do we protect ourselves in those situations?
It's a tough question. And I mean, this is real, right? So you have here where I live in Houston, you have tons of refineries and oil and gas industry, OT industry. And we all know that there is a lot of vulnerabilities without disclosing anything that is not already publicly known, because it happened in Russia, in Ukraine, and several other states that nation states attack each other on these critical infrastructures. And the concern is, if you are a CISO for a company that has a lot of OT assets, already there's tons of vulnerabilities that technically cannot be fixed easily. So there's a lot of risk, and you need to make this very transparent. And I think that has maybe not been done as good as it should have been in the past. And there needs to be improvements from the communication upwards and to the board, and then to the regulators as well. But because you said the loss of life, so there have been things happening in the past that was impacted. Like, I forgot the location. I think it was hopefully I'm not mistaken, I think it was in Florida, where they actually had a water pump that actually put in chlorine or something into that water, and that has affected people. And in other cases, in other countries, similar types of attacks are happening. So this is a serious risk, and this is not to be ignored. And I think it's not only about money, it's really about human lives and persons, and that is not even addressed by these regulators, right? So the SEC is predominantly concerned about the financial investors, and I think there needs to be actually more cybersecurity governance to protect human lives across the countries or across the world in the different industries, including OT security. But it's a big gap, and I think there needs to be urgent action, not wait another decade, but do it now. That's important.
Critical infrastructure, I completely agree. And the last thing, which we'll close on, is my favorite topic, and I know from our previous conversation, your topic as well, culture.
Yes.
Right? So much of this comes down to culture. The culture of blame versus culture of enablement, the culture of owning security as a responsibility as opposed to pointing fingers, the culture of sharing transparently. I mean, there is so much to it. We've always talked about culture, and you and I have agreed that is not about awareness and training. That's just a very small part of it. It's all these other things. What do you think, Michael, like looking at this now, reflecting on our previous conversations, how important will the role of culture become now?
I think security is actually all about culture. It's not about technology. And that was mistaken from many over the last 2 or 3 decades, that they put the CISO in the technology team and not understanding that this is a business problem and that shortcuts are human nature, that people are not taking the necessary time to read something, read the policies, read the standards, and actually apply them and do them. And to put it back into perspective for this case here with the SEC, they actually charged that a password like SolarWinds 123, would not fulfill their own password policy. And I reviewed that and I said, no, it's actually not right. It's not accurate. The SEC is wrong there. The password policy says 3 out of 4, like uppercase, lowercase character, numbers, and a special character. And that has 3 out of 4. SolarWinds, even if it is all lowercase, and then 123 is the numbers and the comma is the special character. So it's a 3 out of 4. The problem and the concern that I bring up, and that is why I explain this, is that we all, as people over the last 20, 30 years, have dealt with passwords, and many people were not following the rules and had not a good culture. And the problem is the SolarWinds 123, is compliant with a password policy, but you miss culture because you don't understand that this is not a secure password. It is easily guessable. It's easily from people to combine, and hackers would definitely have that on their top 100 list to try it out, right? Maybe not with the comma, but over time they would try it out. So the culture is very, very important to start there. Educate your employees, and it starts at the very top. The C-suite needs to be informed and actually empowering and empowered to do these things. And then the folks underneath and the rank and file employees and the different management levels, they all are part of that. Cyber security cannot be accomplished by the CISO alone or the security department alone. It's not like these resources, let's say it's a 50 or 100 or maybe 1,000 people, they cannot compete with 100,000 people or 200,000 people. That's not possible. Everyone has his or her own duty in security. They need to play by the rules, understand the why, and that's important from the CISO to actually ingrain the culture where you explain why are these rules important, why are these controls there. We are not sitting in a dark room somewhere in the middle of the night and think about what can I do to really terrify my employees, to make really life hard for them, to really make it so complicated that they don't know how to do it. We are not doing the MFA to make it another step. We do multi-factor authentication with a phone and not using SMS, but actually more secure authentication methods, because the hackers are always upgrading their arsenal, because all these new vulnerabilities and other security controls makes it necessary to continuously up the game, raising the bar. That is why we do that. And the people need to understand why, and then what needs to happen, and then how it needs to happen, and then do regular trainings, regular education series, prove it to them. There's different companies, different people types. Do it with either fun, with games, and like gamification. Do it with videos. Do it with whatever works in your employee base. Make them aware. Have an open door policy. Regularly make certain events to bring it into the mindset and change that mindset. And don't do this from a like dictatorship perspective. You say this is how it is, and then everyone has to follow without any explanation. You need to explain why are the controls necessary. Here are the controls. Show to them how they could be overcome, and therefore what we have as additional controls. And then think about this defense in depth, right? Don't rely on one single control. You always have to have defense in depth, multiple controls. It's the only way in this day and life to secure your enterprise. And without that, companies will fail. The last 30 years have shown that you need to have these concepts, the key concepts that really work if they are applied well and continuously upgraded, and it keeps the company out of the news, out of the press, or in this case, out of the law, out of the courtroom, right? It's very important to have that culture change. And I can say I've published books, you have published books, we have communicated in conferences and other such social gatherings. I always, even if I have a good beer or wine with someone else or a chat at any sort of conference, regardless what their role is, I always communicate with them, why is cybersecurity so important? Why is it so hard? What can they do in their own world to improve? And maybe you give them examples what they can do at home, and then they take that into the company and do it there as well, right? But what we absolutely should stop, and that was another case here in the SolarWinds world, is you can't say bring your own device without any sorts of controls. You must make sure that these bring your own devices are following company policies if they are allowed in. And if people are not following policies, that's not the CISO's fault. That's the fault of these folks that are just ignoring facts. And this is the same in regular civilization, right? You have folks that are criminals that are just not following the rules, that are just doing whatever they want to do, and that's not tolerable. But you actually do not put the whatever the Minister of Security or Defense into jail. That's not what you do. You actually punish the people that do the wrongdoing, right? And not the governance person, so to speak, that has helped create those rules or has helped create those controls and put them into place. But if people sidetrack and bypass security controls, they need to be accountable for that. But don't put the CISO in the jail. That's absolutely nonsense.
Yeah, and look, you nailed so many great things on the culture front. And I'll also say, along those lines, we cannot emphasize enough the importance of testing your incident response processes, your communication and breach response processes. You do that well, you test them well, you'll always need to adapt. But to me, I think when I sit down with executives and I do tabletop exercises, the aha moments that go off, and these things are like, you got to immerse yourself in these things to actually understand how you will react, and you will quickly realize you will need to make decisions and execs, not your CISOs, not your CIO or CTO. You as an exec will need to make those decisions. Michael, when we started this chat, I was thinking we'll keep this to 30 minutes, but with you, there is so much to discuss, and I love the fact that you're so passionate about this, and as am I, and we could keep talking about this for the 2 hours. And I always feel like, did we cover everything? There's so much still left, but I know that you're giving us this valuable time, and it's night time where you are currently in Texas. So I want to give you massive thanks for jumping on this on this episode at short notice, and for having this important conversation. And I love the fact that you fearlessly share your insights. You are you're not afraid to put your views out there, and I really like that. We want to have an open conversation that actually gives people something to think about and action, as opposed to the same old stuff which doesn't really move the dial. Massive thanks to you, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chirag, for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation as well. And yes, I could go on and on, but I think for now it's good. But we can definitely do a third one. I really appreciate you, and best of luck to you in Australia. All the best over there, guys.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the audience. Thank you for tuning in. And a shout out to the audience. If you like what we've been doing, please subscribe, because then we can actually share more meaningful content and get a lot more awesome guests like Michael on the show. So thank you for that. Take care, and we'll see you next time.